and welcome to BrainX here at Ramada Kelowna. Coming up, we're going to hear from some of the most inspired thinkers in the field as they share some powerful insights into brain injury.
Just over 3 years ago, I was a recently divorced, middle-aged neuroscience professor at UBC Okanagan who studied the effect of traumatic brain injuries or concussion on athletes. And then I did something that changed my life forever. I swiped right. And this is what happened.
Don't panic. We're not actually doing a presentation on how to meet your perfect partner online.
Why not?
Well, we could. So if you want to have us back next year to take a totally different approach, we're willing to do that. But we did meet on an online dating site, and we fell in love. A neuroscientist with an expertise in concussion and the executive director of a women's shelter. Not long after we started dating, oh, except I'm not supposed to say that yet.
Anyone had told us 3 years ago when we met on that online dating site, or even 30 years ago when we started our respective professional careers, what we'd be doing today, we wouldn't have believed them.
But we did meet on an online dating site, and we fell in love, like I said. It seems a little silly, but the story of how we came to be is kind of important, so we thought we'd start with it. My goodness, you'd think I'd never done this presentation before. So 3 years ago, we started dating, blah, 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 blah. Not long after that, I read this article. And this article said that a large proportion of women who have survived intimate partner violence have also experienced a traumatic brain injury.
Now, we've heard quite a bit this morning on the effects of concussion, the effects that they can have in terms of things like headache and memory loss and difficulty concentrating and paying attention. Imagine the impact it might have on your life. Say you're playing a pickup game of hockey with your buddies and you accidentally fall and hit your head on the ice. You struggle to make it back to the bench, feeling nauseous and dizzy, and you might head home that evening with a splitting headache that makes it difficult to fall asleep. You might find yourself a day or two later having a challenge carrying on a conversation with friends or colleagues, or worse yet, not being able to remember how to get to your daughter's school to pick her up at the end of the day. We've all seen the headlines about the effects of concussion in professional athletes, Sidney Crosby being the kind of test case in all of this. And many of you may have seen the movie starring Will Smith that examined the brutal effects of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, in professional athletes. But how big is this problem really? Well, let's take a look at the numbers. In Canada, there are about 640,000 hockey players throughout the country. That includes kids as young as 4 or 5 years of age, all the way up to old-timers like me. And every year, about 10% of them, or 64,000, will end up getting diagnosed with a concussion. If you look just at the NHL, there are about 700 players on the combined rosters of all the teams, and each year about 5% of them, or 35 players, will suffer a concussion. So I think given these numbers, you can see why some people are calling it a concussion epidemic. But how does it compare to what we see in women who are survivors of intimate partner violence?
So there are about 12 million women in Canada between the ages of 20 and 54. So how many of them will experience violence or abuse at the hands of a loved one? I'm going to ask you to help me answer that question. If you take a look on the front of your chair, on the metal portion on the front of your chair, you're going to have to move around. Anyone who has a sticker, probably a little red or other colored sticker, I want you to stand up, please. And please stay standing for a minute. Now, I know we have some empty chairs, so if you have one in your table that's empty and has a sticker, someone else could stand up. Now, take a look around the room. Everybody who's standing represents the fully 1 in 3 women in our country who will experience abuse at the hands of a partner in their lifetime. Shocking, right? And here's the thing to consider. Those are reported incidents. And we know there's so much stigma still attached to this issue that a lot of these incidents go unreported. So the number in reality is much, much higher. You can sit down. Thank you. Now, when you break it down by year, the Centers for Disease Control in the US found that about 2.3% of women in the United States would experience intimate partner violence each year. If you assume similar numbers here in Canada, that's 276,000 women. So how many of those will also experience a traumatic brain injury? Of the women who presented at hospital emergency rooms and at women's shelters like the one that I operate, as many as 90% reported symptoms consistent with concussion or traumatic brain injury. That amounts to 250,000 Canadian women each year. I want to put that in a little bit of context for you. For every one NHL player who experiences a concussion playing the sport he loves, more than 7 women experience 7,000 women. Well, that took the power away, didn't it? Even 7's bad enough. 7,000 women in Canada suffer that same injury at the hands of the men they love.
With athletes, we've got strict protocols mandating when it's safe to return to play after a concussion. Take Bob. He's knocked out of the big game after getting body checked into the boards, and after he's helped off the ice by his teammates, he's taken into the dressing room by the trainers and the doctors and is given an assessment to look for signs and symptoms of a concussion. And if he's diagnosed, he's told to take some time off to rest and recover. Over the following few weeks or perhaps days or perhaps weeks, he'll be reassessed a number of times, and if he recovers normally, he'll be cleared to return to play.
And then there's Susan. Susan is one of the more than 6,000 women who seek refuge from violence and abuse in shelters across this country every single night. She and her son, Christopher, arrive at our shelter at 2 a.m. He's in his PJs, clutching a stuffy he managed to grab as they raced out of the house. Susan has her purse, some basic ID, and a black eye, not her first. Over the years she's been with her husband, she has had countless black eyes, tons of bruises, and she's dealt with the kind of ongoing emotional torment that nobody should have to experience. This last time, he smashed her head up against the kitchen wall so many times she lost count before she finally managed to grab Christopher and flee the house because her husband went downstairs to get another beer from the drinks fridge. During her 30-day stay at our shelter, she's expected to accomplish a lot. She has to find safe, affordable housing for her and Christopher. She has to parent. That's not an easy thing any day of the week. She maybe has to deal with lawyers about support or child access. Maybe find a job or apply for social assistance because up until now, she stayed home with Christopher. So what if, in addition to dealing with that, and the trauma, and the fear, and the anxiety of finally having left this ongoing abusive relationship, Susan is also dealing with the impact of a traumatic brain injury? I wanted to know why nobody was talking about this. Why researchers and scientists like Paul seemed more concerned with professional athletes than women. No disrespect to any of the athletes in the room. We all know women make up a far larger proportion of the population than professional athletes, and they are expected to and do accomplish a lot.
So together with the students in my research lab, we scoured the literature to see what work had been done in this area. And the short answer is not much. There's really only a handful of studies which have looked at the basic question of how frequently women who've survived intimate partner violence have also suffered a traumatic brain injury. Researchers at Harvard have shown that survivors of intimate partner violence have difficulty with memory and cognitive flexibility, and show changes in the functional connectivity in brain areas that are associated with cognitive deficits that are consistent with traumatic brain injury. So it's clear that we're really just scratching the surface so far with this research, and that there's much work left to be done to look at the intersection of traumatic brain injury and intimate partner violence.
So Paul and I decided to combine our expertise and passion on this topic and launch a research study to try and fill that knowledge gap. I recruited participation from a couple of other local nonprofits that work with survivors of intimate partner violence in order that we could really ensure a broader base of subjects.
The goal is to use objective measures to determine the extent of brain dysfunction in this population. Now, one of the challenges with concussion is that there's no real definitive or conclusive test to diagnose it. And instead, clinicians rely on subjective reports of symptoms to help them diagnose and manage the injury. And unlike when a doctor assesses a broken bone, for example, with an X-ray, it's really difficult to visualize when a concussion has occurred. Let me show you what we mean. So this is evidence from structural MRI, so an imaging modality that allows you to see into the tissue of the body. And this is a structural MRI of someone who suffered a stroke. And you can see on the left hemisphere there where there's this highlighted area, which is showing different activation or different levels of visualization than what you see in the rest of the brain. So this is evidence of the damage that occurs in a stroke. Here's a structural MRI of someone with multiple sclerosis. So here the immune system attacks the myelin, gets confused and thinks that the myelin is a foreign body and attacks it and starts to break it down. And again, it shows up as these white spots now distributed throughout the brain. Finally, here's a structural MRI of someone who's had a concussion. Now, I'm not a real doctor, I'm just a PhD. If there are any neuroradiologists in the room, they would tell you that that's a normal looking brain. Okay, so despite the fact that the brain looks normal, the person has challenges, right, in terms of the symptoms, the headache, the nausea, for example. So in the research that we're doing in my lab, we're focused on coming up with objective measures of concussion, so clinicians won't have to rely on these subjective reports of symptoms. One approach we're using is to look at the potential physiological changes that are occurring with the injury. So for example, by measuring the blood flow to the brain under different conditions, we can make inferences about how the injury has affected physiological function and then relate that back to the symptoms the person's reporting. A second approach is using what's called blood biomarkers, so signatures in the blood supply itself that are consistent with an injury response. So for example, inflammation is a very common injury response. When you twist your ankle, you get edema around the ankle as a part of the injury response. The same thing happens in the brain. It's called neuroinflammation. So when inflammation occurs, it leaves a signature in the blood supply that if you take a blood draw and analyze that resulting signatures in those blood, you can make some inferences about, again, the injury response. So our goal in this research is to apply these measures to survivors of intimate partner violence. Now, one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that in this population, the concussion, if it's occurred, is just one aspect of the abuse. And indeed, quite often, survivors of intimate partner violence suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. Things that we don't normally see in young athletes who've had a concussion. And so, oops. Sorry, get back to Susan. And so, as well as these functional tests in the lab that I described, we'll also do interview questionnaires to assess these emotional disturbances and then control for them statistically. So last year when I came to talk, we had literally just started this project. I think we had collected one participant. And since then, we've done initial screening on over 40 women through the women's shelter. And we've done the lab-based assessments on about half of those. So what have we seen? Sorry, just let me get to the...
It's good I'm not the only one who makes mistakes, isn't it?
So one of the things we did is we asked them about their symptoms. So there's a concussion, actually a sport concussion questionnaire that we give all of our athletes that asks them questions around headaches and nausea and dizziness and difficulty concentrating. And you can do just a simple, how many of these symptoms do you report having? And so this graph shows those results in young athletes that we've tested in our lab and then in intimate partner violence survivors. The key things to look at here are the rightmost bars on each graph. So in the rightmost bar for the athletes, those are participants who've just suffered a concussion. So this is within 3 days of having their injury. They report around 10 or 11 of these symptoms like headache or nausea. In the rightmost bar under the IPV survivors category are women who've experienced intimate partner violence. And you can see that they're suffering from about 14 or so of these symptoms. The interesting thing to note is that whereas the athletes were tested within 3 days of being diagnosed with acute concussion, the intimate partner survivors, the earliest, the most recent episode was 3 months before. And in some cases, it was up to 5 or 6 years before we tested them in the lab. So there's a big impact of being in this situation. The second thing we looked at is, again, this physiology. And one aspect of that we've examined is what's called cerebral autoregulation. So all that is the relationship between changes in blood pressure in your body and cerebral blood flow going into your brain. And I won't bore you with the details, but because it'll take about half an hour to describe this in detail. But what I'm showing here in these two traces are just the measures of blood pressure and cerebral blood velocity in a task where we just simply get the people to do stand squat maneuvers at different frequencies, 0.05 hertz and 0.1 hertz. When you do that, you systematically alter systemic blood pressure, and that causes systematic changes in cerebral blood flow. And the extent to which those blood pressure changes get transmitted into cerebral blood flow is what cerebral autoregulation is. We've seen in young athletes who've just had a concussion that relationship is disrupted, and we're seeing similar things in survivors of intimate partner violence.
So what are we going to do with all this data? And there's lots of it. Like Paul said, just one little piece he could take half an hour talking about. The fact is, although some really good early work has been done, we don't really still have a good idea how traumatic brain injury particularly affects women who've survived intimate partner violence. At shelters like ours and others across the country, we don't screen or assess for brain injury. In fact, part of the research work we're doing with UBC involves surveys of frontline workers to find out what their level of knowledge is on traumatic brain injury right now. Some of the early results of that show, not much, and that frontline workers really want specific training so that they can start to know what the signs and symptoms are and perhaps provide better supports. Because if a woman is experiencing the impacts of traumatic brain injury, and it's causing her to have a lot of challenges with all the things she needs to do while staying at a shelter, it's frustrating for her, and it's really frustrating for the people who are really working to support her.
And you can contrast that with what happens when someone gets a traumatic brain injury from a fall or a car accident, for example. As soon as the person is diagnosed, supports and services in the community, like what Brain Trust offers, can be accessed in the hopes that the person can recover to normal function.
And our hope is to be able to create something like that for women who've survived intimate partner violence. When we work with women, we do it through what we call a trauma-informed lens. Every interaction, every conversation, every piece of work we do through trauma counseling, it's all done within this context of understanding the impacts of trauma. So what if we could add a brain injury-informed lens to this trauma-informed lens? We could maybe get better funding from our funders to allow for longer stays with us instead of just 30 days, so that we could work more closely with women, help them get the supports they need to move forward in life. We could do intake assessments and train our staff so they would know the signs and symptoms and they could provide better supports. We could learn more about what resources are in the community to which we could refer clients. All some really, really big changes if we could make that a piece of the puzzle.
And then there are the larger societal implications. Each year, it's estimated that Canadians collectively spend about $7.4 billion dealing with the aftermath of intimate partner violence. This can include tangible costs such as emergency room visits, loss of income, and in some cases funerals, as well as intangible costs associated with pain and suffering. If our research can increase knowledge and awareness of this issue, change policies and procedures in places like the women's shelter, and make even a tiny dent in the financial and societal costs associated with the effects of intimate partner violence, then what we're doing will be very worthwhile.
So what does all of it mean for Susan? And you can give her any name you want, really. As a survivor of intimate partner violence, Susan could be any number of women. She's the clerk at the grocery store you shop at. She's that mom you always see at the park with her kids. She's your colleague at work. She is your cousin. She's you. She's me. And in the end, she is what this is all about.
The fact is, women make up over half the population, and too many of them are still suffering from the effects of intimate partner violence. The impact on them, their kids, their family, their friends, and society as a whole is huge. Survivors of intimate partner violence need to know that even if they don't make the headlines or are the subject of a blockbuster Hollywood film, we're committed to expanding research into the impact of concussion in a big way beyond athletes, because we know helping them achieve a healthy life free from abuse is good for all of us.
And to think, it all started with a swipe.
That's all from us here at the Brain X Symposium. If you'd like more information on any of today's topics, you can head over to Brain Trust Canada's website. I'm your host, Lucy Hazelwood. Until next time, this is Shore TV.